My name is Sloane Everhart. I'm 33 years old. And the night before my wedding, in a private room at the Thornfield Hunt Club, my future mother-in-law stood up in front of 80 guests, lifted a folder off her lap like she was handing out an award, and told the whole table I had nothing to bring to her family but ambition and a good smile. Then she slid that folder down the white tablecloth until it hit my bread plate. "Sign it, gold digger," she said, loud enough for the back tables to hear, loud enough that nobody in that room could pretend they hadn't. I picked up the pen. Welcome back. If you've ever sat at a table where people who owed you everything decided out loud that you were worth nothing, stay with me. Drop a comment if this one's already hitting close, and subscribe, because what was actually inside that folder is not what anyone in that room was expecting. To understand why I didn't flinch, you have to go back to a garage in Millbrook, Ohio, and a man who raised me on socket wrenches and one hard rule. My grandfather, Slid Everhart, worked the line at a bearing plant for 31 years. When my mother left and never came back, and my father decided fatherhood wasn't for him either, Slid didn't sit me down and have a talk about it. He just handed me a rag and told me to get under the truck with him. I was 7. I spent my whole childhood under that truck, or at his workbench, or standing at his elbow while he explained why a bolt strips if you rush it. He had one rule, and he said it so many times it stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like breathing. You don't ask for a seat at somebody's table. You build your own table, and then you decide who sits at it. When he died, I was 22, 3 semesters from finishing my engineering degree and completely broke. He didn't leave me money. There wasn't any. He left me his tools, a coffee can of loose bolts and one wrench, a 9/16, worn smooth on the handle from 30 years of his grip. I still carry it. It's in my coat pocket right now, actually, and it was in my coat pocket that night at Thornfield. I started my company 2 years after his funeral with $4,000, a rented corner of somebody else's warehouse, and that wrench sitting on my desk like a paperweight. I built small automation rigs for machine shops that couldn't afford the big manufacturers. I slept maybe 4 hours a night for the first 3 years. I learned to weld because I couldn't pay a welder. I learned contract law because I couldn't pay a lawyer. Every single thing that company is today, I built with my own hands before I ever built it with anyone else's money. Today, Everhart Dynamics makes precision robotics for auto plants and medical device manufacturers in 11 states. We employ 210 people. Last year, an outside firm valued the company at just north of $90 million. You would never guess that looking at me. I drive a 2011 pickup with a cracked windshield I keep meaning to fix. I wear flannel to client meetings unless I absolutely can't. My hands are still rough, because I still get down on the shop floor when a line's behind schedule. Money, to me, has never been something you show. It's something you build quietly and protect fiercely, because I learned a long time ago what happens to a woman who lets people see exactly how much she has. The asking starts. The looks change. Friends turn into people with a pitch. So I got good at looking like I had nothing, and I let people believe the flinch when I paid for something was real. I want you to hold on to that, because it's the whole reason what happened at Thornfield went the way it did. The Prescotts spent 2 years convinced they were rescuing their son from a woman with a truck and a garage job. They had absolutely no idea what was parked in my driveway. I met Nathaniel Prescott on a Saturday morning at a repair cafe in a church basement, the kind of place where people bring broken toasters and busted bike chains and volunteers, fix them for free. I ran the small engine table most weekends when I had time, because my grandfather taught me that fixing things for people who can't afford to fix them themselves is its own kind of church. Nate showed up with a 10-year-old bicycle with a snapped chain and a bent derailleur, wearing a shirt with an actual hole in the elbow, and he sat across the folding table from me for 40 minutes arguing with me about whether it was worth saving. It was. I fixed it. He asked if he could buy me coffee as a thank you, and I said only if he let me pick the diner, because I don't do places with cloth napkins. He laughed like that was the easiest yes he'd ever given. Nate is a public defender, not the kind of law that makes anyone rich. He takes home less in a year than my top shop foreman. He drives a Honda with 200,000 miles on it and patches his own jeans instead of buying new ones, not because he can't, but because it's who he is. For 4 months, he never once asked me what I did for money beyond. I run a manufacturing company. And he never once asked what that meant in numbers. He asked what I was reading. He asked what my grandfather was like. He asked if I wanted to split a pie or get my own, which, if you know anything about diners, is the real test of character. For the first time since Silas died, I didn't feel like I had to manage what somebody saw of me. I told myself it was because he had kind eyes and terrible taste in bicycles. Really, it was because he was the first person in a decade who never once did the math on me. I understood why the day I met his mother. I knew the name Prescott before I knew Nate, the way everyone in that part of Connecticut did. There's a Prescott reading room at the county library, a Prescott wing at the regional hospital. Prescott Mills ran 3 towns for almost 100 years before the mill closed in the 80s. It's the kind of name that gets you a table without a reservation, the kind of name people still say with a small straightening of the spine, even now, even though the mill's been a parking lot longer than it was ever a mill. Nate carried that name the way you carry a coat that doesn't fit anymore. He'd walked away from the family business track years before I met him, taken the public defender job his mother called adorable in the worst way a person can say that word, and built a small, quiet life that was entirely his own. Being with me, he told me once, felt like setting something heavy down. "It's why I love you," he said early on. "You have no idea who my family is, and you wouldn't care if you did." I laughed and told him he was right. I didn't care about the wing on the hospital or the room at the library. What I didn't understand yet was how carefully he said my family, the way you'd name a storm system still 3 states away, still gathering. The first dinner was at the Prescott house, a big colonial with white columns and a lawn so perfect it looked embarrassed by itself. Diana Prescott met me at the door in a cream suit and a smile with a blade folded up inside it. She took my hand, held it a beat too long, looked at my plain black dress, and asked, warmly, who did my alterations. "I don't really do alterations," I said. "I mostly buy what fits." "How practical," she said, in the exact tone you'd use for a word like cheap, and the smile never moved an inch. At the table, Nate's sister, Odette, leaned in like she was conducting a survey for a magazine that didn't exist. "So what does your family do? Are you from around here?" "My grandfather raised me. He's passed." "Oh," Odette said, and let the silence finish the sentence for her. They were kind the way a locked door is polished. Every question had a floor underneath it, and the floor was always the same one. Where do you come from, and is it anywhere that matters? I sat there running a company that outbuilt Prescott Mills by a factor I could have written on a napkin, and I let them believe the truck in the driveway was the whole story. Nate squeezed my hand under the table like he was proud of how well I was taking it. I told myself I was being gracious. The truth is older and uglier than that. I was doing the thing I'd always done, making myself smaller so nobody would have a reason to send me away. Here's what I need you to understand, because otherwise nothing that happens later makes sense. I did not want the Prescotts' money. I would find out later there wasn't any real money left to want. What I wanted, and I'm not proud of this, was the table. I grew up with a coffee can of bolts and a grandfather in a garage. No cousins at Thanksgiving. No big loud family arguing about nothing over dessert. I built a company out of nothing because that's the one thing I knew how to do. You cannot build a family out of nothing. Somebody has to let you in. So when Nate got down on one knee in the church basement, by the small engine table, on the 1-year anniversary of the day we met, with a plain gold band he'd saved 4 months of a public defender's salary to buy, I didn't think about his mother even once. I thought, finally, somewhere that was standing before me and will keep standing after. I said yes before he finished the question. I had absolutely no idea. I just handed his family the exact thing they knew how to use. Diana asked to see the ring the way a jeweler checks for a flaw. She turned my hand toward the window light, studied the thin gold band, and said, "How sentimental," like sentimental was a diagnosis. Then she got to work. Within a week, she'd appointed herself the architect of a wedding I never asked her to build. It would be at Thornfield, obviously, because Prescotts had always married at Thornfield. The guest list would run through her, because there were people whose grandfathers had known Nate's grandfather. When I mentioned wanting to invite my shop foreman, Ruth, and her wife, who'd been at my side through 11 years of near misses and one very real bankruptcy scare, Diana said, "We'll see about the room." Everything I wanted was something we'd see about. Everything they wanted was already decided. I watched a wedding that was supposed to be mine turn into a performance of a family I was allowed to attend, but never allowed to shape. And I let it happen, because pushing back felt like handing them a reason. If you've ever sat at a table where your welcome came with fine print, you already know the particular silence I'm talking about. The one where you swallow the sentence you meant to say and smile instead. That silence is about to get very loud. And it starts with a cup of coffee Nate's sister invited me to 3 weeks later that she called just getting to know each other. It wasn't. Odette invited me to coffee 3 weeks after that first dinner, just the two of us, to get to know each other before the wedding, she said. I should have known better the second she showed up carrying a leather folder to a coffee date. She spent the first 10 minutes being warmer than she'd ever been. Then the real questions started, and they weren't the questions of a woman getting to know her future sister-in-law. Where did I live exactly? Did I own or rent? Nate mentioned a garage. Was that the business? How many people worked for me, roughly? Was it seasonal work? She was mapping me. I could see her running the numbers behind her eyes with every answer, and here's the part that took me a minute to understand. She wasn't trying to find out how much I had. She was trying to confirm how little. She wanted it on record that I was a woman with a truck and a small seasonal operation and no family behind me, the kind of woman who could only be marrying into the Prescotts for one reason. So I let her write that story. I gave her small, true, incomplete answers, and I watched her leave that coffee shop certain she'd caught something. I drove home knowing exactly what that meeting had been. Not a welcome, a deposition. If you've ever had someone in your life quietly building a case against you while smiling the whole time, comment deposition below, because part 3 is where that folder finally gets used against them instead. The small cruelties came steady after that, the kind nobody can ever quite call out loud. At dinner, Diana would watch which fork I picked up and correct me with nothing but a look, a half-second too fast for anyone else to catch. When I mentioned a book I loved, Odette would say, "Oh, that's fun," in the voice you use for a child's crayon drawing. When I talked, Diana had a habit of waiting exactly one beat and then repeating what I'd said back in slightly better words, like she was translating me for the table. I've negotiated 7-figure supply contracts with men who tried to bury me in fine print. I have never in my life felt as managed as I felt at that table. Every correction carried the same quiet message underneath it. You can visit here, you cannot stay. And the cruelty of it was that none of it was loud enough to name. If I'd said, "Your mother keeps correcting me," Nate could have honestly said, "She corrected your fork, that's all." That was the whole design. Death by 1,000 small forks. I started dreading the drive to that house. I, who once told a purchasing manager exactly where he could put his lowball bid, started rehearsing sentences in my truck so I'd sound like a person they wouldn't need to fix. I finally said something to Nate on the drive home from one of those dinners. Not an accusation, just a small, tired truth. "Your mother doesn't like me." He sighed the sigh of a man who'd been managing that particular weather system his whole life. "She's like that with everyone. Give her time." Then, quieter, "Just don't give her anything to hold on to." I asked him what that meant. "You know, don't make waves. Let her run the wedding, it's easier." I looked out the window at the dark trees going by and felt something I didn't have a name for yet. I'd wanted him to say, "She's wrong about you and I'll make her stop." Instead, he'd asked me to be quieter, to hand his mother the wheel so the ride would be smooth. And the worst part is that I understood him completely. He'd spent 36 years learning that the way to survive Diana Prescott was to give her nothing to grip. He wasn't betraying me. He was teaching me his own survival skill. I didn't want to survive her, though. I wanted him to stand in front of me. And I was starting to wonder, lying awake that night, What would happen the day quiet stopped being enough? I heard the word for the first time through a door I wasn't supposed to be behind. It was another Sunday dinner, and I'd gone looking for a bathroom in a hallway I didn't know, and I heard Diana's voice coming low and certain from the study, a register she never used in front of guests. "We need to protect the family," she was saying. Odette's voice answered, something I couldn't quite catch. Then Diana again, clear as a bell through the door. "She's clearly after what's left. A gold digger, plain as that. Some women see a name and smell an opportunity." I stood in that dark hallway with my hand flat on the wall and didn't move. Gold digger. I'd spent my whole adult life so careful about being wanted for my money that I'd hidden it from almost everyone. And here was a woman deciding I was a thief for money I had never seen and did not need. But it was 3 other words that kept me rooted to that spot. After what's left. You don't say what's left about a full account. You say it about a draining one. You say it about the bottom of something. I went back to the table. I smiled through the rest of dinner, and I started, very quietly, to pay attention. Here's what I found, and I want you to understand I wasn't looking for it. I opened the wrong door on a Saturday visit looking for a powder room, and it was Diana's study, and the first thing I saw was the wall. A clean, bright rectangle in the middle of faded wallpaper, the exact size and shape of a painting that used to hang there. I know that shape. It's the ghost a picture leaves after it's hung in one spot for decades and then suddenly hasn't. There were more of them around that room, pale rectangles where things used to be. A cabinet stood open, half empty. And on the desk, not hidden, just sitting the way things sit in a house where no guest is ever supposed to wander, was a short stack of mail. The top envelope had a bank's return address and a red stamp across the front I could read from the doorway. Past due. Under it, the corner of a glossy sheet, the kind auction houses send when they're appraising estate items. I stood very still with my hand in my coat pocket, and without deciding to, I closed my fingers around Silas's wrench, the way I do when the ground stops feeling steady. And the whole story turned over in my hands like a coin landing the other side up. They hadn't looked down on me because I had nothing. They'd looked down on me because I had something real, something growing, something mine, and they were quietly, desperately running out of theirs. The name on the library room and the hospital wing was a beautiful front on a house that had already been sold to the bank in every way that mattered. Diana wasn't protecting a fortune from a gold digger. She was hiding the absence of one, and she needed a thief in the room so nobody looked too closely at the empty vault. After that door, every insult I'd swallowed changed flavor in my mouth. It had never been about protecting a legacy. There was no legacy left to protect. It was about controlling the story, keeping every eye in the room on the poor, unsuitable woman Nate had dragged home, so nobody counted the empty spaces on the walls. I didn't hate Diana after that. I want to be honest about that. Because it complicates things in a way that matters later. I started against my will to see her. Later that same visit, I passed the study again and the door was cracked, and she was in there alone, holding one of the empty frames, polishing the glass over nothing, her hands moving in small, careful circles. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know I saw. She'd have died before she let me see. I understood, watching her, that 40 years ago she'd probably walked into this family from somewhere with less, and been measured at the door herself. She wasn't the author of the cruelty. She was its longest-serving employee. You'd think, knowing what I knew, I'd have walked away with my dignity and my $90 million company and never looked back. I didn't, because I still loved Nate, the real one, the man with the hole in his elbow and the terrible bicycle. And because knowing they had nothing didn't cure me of wanting them. It just changed what I was afraid of. I decided I wouldn't use what I knew, not to hurt them. I kept the secret. I kept showing up smaller, hoping that if I was patient and good and quiet enough, the door would open on its own. I still thought welcome was something you could earn your way into. I was about to find out the door had never been closed to keep me out. It had been closed so they could choose exactly the moment to open it and make sure everyone was watching when they did. The prenup arrived dressed as a formality. Nate told me 3 weeks before the wedding, looking at his shoes instead of at me. "Mom thinks we should have a prenup. just to make everyone comfortable. Odette's having her lawyer draw something up. I asked to see it. When it came, I read it twice to be sure I understood what I was holding. It wasn't a prenup in any fair sense of that word. It was a surrender. In the event of divorce, I would leave with nothing. Worse than nothing, the document defined everything I brought into the marriage, including my business, as family property, held in a Prescott trust. They wanted me to sign my life's work, the company I'd built with a wrench and $4,000 and no sleep, over to a family that was quietly hiding past due notices in a locked study. And the beautiful, absurd logic of it was this: they still believed I was poor. They thought Everhart Dynamics was a truck and a garage. This whole crushing document had been written to protect a fortune that didn't exist, from a fortune they didn't know existed either. I sat with it a long time. I didn't call my lawyer yet. I wanted to see how far they'd take it. I wanted to see if the man I loved would take it there with them. I laid their document flat on our kitchen table where he couldn't pretend not to see it, and I asked him one question. "Do you know what this says?" He read it. I watched his face for the anger, the moment he'd crumple it in his fist and say absolutely not. "You are not signing this." That's not what happened. He read it, and he got quiet, and then he said the words that changed something between us that I'm still not sure ever fully came back. "Just sign it. It's only paper. You and I both know we'll never get divorced, so it doesn't matter what it says. Sign it, make her comfortable, and then we can just be happy." I looked at the man I loved across my own kitchen table and understood he was asking me to sign my grandfather's wrench away, sign away every 4 a.m. shift and every welding burn on my forearms, to make his mother comfortable, to hand over everything I'd built on paper, so a woman who'd called me a thief in her own study could feel she'd won. "It's only paper," he said, the way people say things when they've never had to build anything and so can't imagine losing it. It wasn't only paper to me. That night I called my attorney, and this time it wasn't to protect myself out of fear. It was quieter than that and harder to name. I asked her to prepare a full financial disclosure, mine, real numbers, laid out plainly for anyone who cared to read them. And I asked her to draft my own agreement, one that protected what I'd built, with one plain page of law at the front explaining exactly why theirs wouldn't survive a courtroom for 10 minutes. I put both folders by the front door. I didn't know yet if I'd open them. I only knew I wasn't walking into anything without them. Odette let it slip 2 days later, the way people let things slip when they want you to know and can't admit it out loud. We were confirming the rehearsal dinner head count, and she mentioned, light as a grocery list, that it would be a full room, 80 guests. "All the important ones," she said, smiling with teeth. "Everyone will be there to witness you joining this family." I went home and sat with that sentence a long time. Witness you joining this family. 80 of the oldest names in the county, gathered on purpose, at the exact moment when refusing would look like the tantrum of an ungrateful woman who'd reached too high. They had chosen their stage. What none of them knew yet was that I'd spent 3 weeks quietly building one of my own. The Thornfield Hunt Club was beautiful the way a stage set is beautiful, if you knew where to look. I knew where to look by then. The flowers on the tables were silk, not fresh, dressed up under low gold light so most people wouldn't notice. The chandeliers had been dimmed just enough to flatter, and just enough to hide the worn patch in the carpet by the fireplace. 80 of the oldest names in the county sat at round tables in their good jewelry, and every one of them believed they were dining in old money's house. I knew better by then. I knew the whole room was held up with nerve and silk flowers, and a name still carved over a library door. Diana worked the room like the performance of her life, radiant, gracious, touching elbows, calling people darling. Odette orbited her, catching every compliment on the reflection. At the far end of the head table sat Walter Prescott, Nate's father, a quiet man I'd barely heard speak in 2 years, and when our eyes met across the room, he didn't look away. Something in his face was almost an apology he didn't have the courage to say out loud yet. I took my seat. My small clutch sat in my lap, and folded flat inside my jacket, close enough to feel against my ribs, was my folder. Their document was already tucked under Diana's place setting, waiting for its moment. Silas's wrench was in my coat pocket, the way it always was on days that mattered. 80 people raised their glasses, and I understood the show had already started, and that everyone in that room was about to get exactly what they came for, just not the way they expected. It happened between the salad and the toast. Diana stood, tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room went soft and attentive the way rooms do for a woman like her. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked warmly about family, about legacy, about the importance of protecting what generations had built. Then, still smiling, still radiant, she reached under her place setting and drew out the folder and slid it down the tablecloth until it stopped in front of me. "There's just one small family matter to attend to first," she said, and her voice carried straight to the back tables, trained there over 40 years. "Sloane, dear, before you join this family, we need you to sign this." She let a pause open, wide enough for every fork in the room to go still. And then, into that silence, she said the sentence she'd apparently been waiting 2 years to say out loud. "Sign it, gold digger. You bring nothing to this family." The room didn't gasp. It did something worse. It held completely still. 80 of the oldest names in the county sat with their forks halfway up, eyes on me, and I could feel the old easy verdict already forming behind their faces. The woman with the garage business and no family, who'd reached too high and finally gotten caught reaching. Nate had gone pale beside me. Odette was watching with the small, hungry stillness of somebody who had waited a long time for a show. And Diana stood over me, gracious and merciless, holding out a pen. I looked down at the document on the tablecloth. Then I looked up at her, and I did the one thing she wasn't prepared for. I smiled, and I picked up the pen. I didn't sign. I read it out loud instead. Calm, into the silence of that whole room, I began reading their document to the 80 witnesses they'd so thoughtfully assembled. "In the event of dissolution of the marriage," I read, "the party of the second part shall relinquish all claim to assets and shall convey any and all business interests, holdings, and property brought into the marriage to the Prescott Family Trust." I paused and looked up. "That's me," I said. "The party of the second part, everything I bring signed over to your family forever. Is that right, Diana?" Her smile flickered. This wasn't the script. In her script, I was supposed to be crying by now, or fleeing, or scrawling my name in shame. Instead, I was reading her own weapon back to her slowly, so everyone in that room could hear exactly what the gracious Prescotts were demanding from the woman they just called nothing. I kept the pen in my hand. I let them all watch me hold it over the signature line, and I felt the whole room lean in, certain they were about to watch a gold digger sign her own surrender. Nate said my name under his breath, half plea, half warning. Odette's chin lifted in something like triumph, and Walter, at the end of the table, set his glass down very carefully, like a man who'd already seen something the rest of them hadn't. "It's a generous document," I said quietly. "It really does account for everything I'm bringing to this family." Then I set the pen down on the tablecloth, next to their document, and I didn't sign it. Into the confused, breathing silence, I reached inside my jacket and took out my own folder, plain manila, and laid it on the table where the light could reach it. "There's just one thing it's missing," I said. "The other party's disclosure. A fair agreement shows both people's numbers, so let me show you mine." I opened it the way you open a door you've kept locked a long time, without hurry, because there was no longer any reason to rush. "Everhart Dynamics," I read. "Industrial robotics and automation, 210 employees, contracts across 11 states." I laid the valuation page face up on the table, and somewhere behind me a fork touched a plate and stopped. I read the properties I owned outright. I read the investment accounts. I laid page after page down as I went, a plain paper trail of a life built with a wrench and no help from anyone at that table. With every page, the arithmetic in that room ran backward and then broke. These weren't the numbers of a woman marrying up. They were the numbers of a woman who could have bought the club, the house on the hill, and the name over the library and had money left over. "You said I bring nothing to this family," I said, looking straight at Diana, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Let's read what nothing looks like." At the head of the table, Walter Prescott put both hands flat on the table and half rose out of his chair, staring at my pages, because he understood before anyone else in that room exactly what those numbers meant. He understood which family in this marriage had been marrying up. He caught himself, sat back down slowly, and did not take his eyes off me. Here's where they thought it would end. They thought I'd slide my own findings across the table now, the way they'd slid theirs, and crush them with it in front of everyone. Take the empty picture frames and the past due stamps and Diana's shaking hands and hold them up to 80 pairs of eyes. It would have been easy. It might even have been fair. And it would have made me exactly what she'd called me, someone who came to that table to take. So I didn't do it. I took out the last page in my folder, my own prenuptial agreement, the one that protected everything I'd built, and I didn't read it to the room. I just laid it down and said, quietly, I brought a document too. Mine protects what I made from anyone who ever decides it's theirs. I was going to sign it and marry into this family anyway, because I wanted to belong here more than I wanted to be safe. Then I stood up. 80 of the oldest names in the county went absolutely silent as I stood, having just given up, in one breath, the wedding I'd dreamed of and possibly the man I loved. I'm not going to sign yours, I said to Diana, and I don't think I'm going to marry into this family. I never actually was. I was going to marry Nate. I turned to him. This was the part I hadn't rehearsed, because there was no rehearsing it. I'll marry you at the courthouse next Tuesday, with nothing changing hands but a promise and no name on it but ours, I said. Or I'll wish you a good life, and I'll go home and build the rest of mine. But I am done earning a seat at a table that already put a price on me. Choose now, Nate. Not for her. For you. The room was utterly silent. I want you to sit in that silence with me for a second, because I did. Standing there, having just lost the wedding, the family, the whole fantasy of somewhere that would keep standing after I got there, I felt something I hadn't expected at all. I felt exactly my own size. Diana found her voice first, and it came out of her low and vicious, meant only for me but loud enough for the front tables to catch. You have no idea what it costs to keep this family's name. For just a second, I did feel it. 40 years of empty frames and shaking hands, and a woman who'd been measured at a door once herself and never stopped bleeding from it. I didn't hate her. I didn't sit back down either. Odette was on her feet now too, mascara starting its own quiet betrayal down her face, her voice pitched for the whole room. You don't get to do this. You have no idea what our family has sacrificed. I have exactly one idea, I said, and I wasn't loud, but something in my voice made her stop mid-sentence. I found the past due notices in your mother's study, Odette, 8 months ago. I never said a word about it to anyone because it wasn't mine to use. It still isn't. I'm not here to take that from you tonight. You could have heard a candle gutter. I'm just done pretending I don't know the difference, I said, between a family that has money and a family that has a name and needs somebody new to blame for the space where the money used to be. Walter Prescott stood up at the head of the table, slow, like a man whose knees had been asking him to sit for 30 years and were finally getting their way. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at me, and then he looked at his son. Nathaniel, he said, and it was the first full sentence I'd ever heard him say at that table without his wife finishing it for him. Get up. The whole room turned to watch what Nate would do next. Nate stood up. For a long second he looked at his mother, and I watched 36 years of learning to be smooth war with something braver underneath it. Then he looked at me, standing there with a folder in my hand and my whole future undecided in front of 80 witnesses, and he did a thing I had never once seen him do in 2 years. He walked around the table, past his mother's outstretched hand, past Odette's mascara and her half-finished sentence, past the chair where he'd sat for a lifetime learning to give this family nothing to hold on to. He came and stood beside me, and he took my hand in front of every single person in that room. Then he turned to Diana, and his voice shook, and he said it anyway. You just showed everyone here exactly who values what in this family. Diana Prescott, who had run every room she'd ever walked into for 40 years, finally lost the performance. Her composure cracked down the middle, and what came out of her wasn't grand. It was small and true and aimed only at me, quiet enough that only the front tables caught it. "You have no idea what it costs to keep a family's name standing." I didn't argue with her. I picked up my folder, and my grandfather's wrench found its way into my palm inside my coat pocket, and I walked out of that beautiful, dimly lit, silk-flowered room with my hand in Nate's. Full size, for the first time in 2 years. We married the following Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I wore a plain navy dress I already owned. Nate wore the good coat with the mended elbow, the one his mother had begged him to retire for 2 years. My shop foreman, Ruth, and her wife stood as witnesses, the women who'd been beside me through 11 years of near misses and one very real bankruptcy scare, the ones Diana had said we'd see about fitting into the guest list. There were no silk flowers and no 80 faces doing arithmetic. There was a clerk, a promise, and nothing changing hands but the truth. Walter came. He stood at the back of that plain, bright room alone, the way he'd watched me across the head table 3 days earlier, and afterward he took both my hands in his and held them a moment. "We were the ones marrying up," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that out loud. Deanna did not come. I didn't expect her to. And standing in that courthouse hallway, I found I didn't need her there to feel like I'd finally arrived somewhere. Here's what happened after, because I know you want the whole ledger, not just the moment. The estate went up for sale that autumn. It turned out the mortgage against it had been refinanced twice in the last 6 years, and the loan was 3 payments behind by the time the rehearsal dinner happened. I didn't cause any of that. I want to be completely clear about that. Because I know how it might sound from outside. I never lifted a finger to sink them. I also never lifted a finger to save them. Their debts were never mine to carry, and their story stopped being mine to write the second I stood up from that table. The library room still has the Prescott name carved over the door. Nobody's taken it down. But the town learned, the way small towns always do eventually, what had been hiding behind that name for years. Walter told me later that the hardest part wasn't the money going. It was watching people stop nodding quite so fast when they said hello. Odette and I have exchanged exactly 4 polite sentences since that night, all of them at Walter's insistence, none of them warm. She sold the leather folder story to anyone who'd listen for a while, the version where I humiliated a grieving family for sport. It didn't stick, not after 80 people had watched the actual documents get read out loud with their own ears. You can spin a rumor. You cannot spin a room full of witnesses. Deanna and I have not spoken since that dinner. Nate calls her twice a month. She answers about half the time. He tells me some of it, and I let him have that relationship without my fingerprints on it, because it's his to build or not build, the same way my company was always mine to build. Walter is the one who surprised me. He calls every other Sunday now, just to talk, mostly about nothing. Last month he asked if he could come by the shop floor and see what I actually do all day, and he stood there for 2 hours in a hard hat, asking real questions, and left looking lighter than I'd ever seen him look at that dinner table. He told me, on his way out, that his own father had built Prescott Mills with his hands the same way I built mine, and that somewhere along the way, the family forgot that part and started worshiping the name instead of the work that earned it. "You remind me who we used to be," he said, "before we started being afraid of losing something we'd already lost." I think about that a lot. Nate is different now, and I don't say that lightly, because I know how often people promise to change and don't. He stood between me and his mother exactly once, in the loudest possible room, and it turns out that's the kind of thing that rewires a person. He still visits his father most weeks. He still won't let his mother back into places she hasn't earned back into. And he learned, slowly, the thing I'd been trying to teach him without ever saying it out loud. That love isn't giving someone nothing to hold on to. It's giving them your whole hand and trusting them not to crush it. I hung my grandfather's wrench on the wall of my office last spring, in the spot where the morning light hits it first. Not in my coat pocket anymore. Not hidden away for the day I might need to hold onto something steady. Right out where anyone who comes in to talk business can see it, cracked handle and all, worth more to me than every empty picture frame that ever hung in that study. Sometimes early, before the floor crew rolls in, I stand and look at it, and I think about the ghost rectangle on Diana's wall, the shape of a painting she sold to keep a name standing a little longer. And I think about what I chose to hang in its place in my own life instead. She spent decades defending a wall with nothing behind it. I spent most of mine ashamed of everything I'd actually built. In the end, only one of us learned to put her worth where the light could reach it. Here's the only lesson I really took from all of it, and I'm giving it to you straight, the way my grandfather would have. Worth isn't something you inherit at somebody else's table. It's something you build with your own 2 hands, and no name carved over any door, no matter how old, gets to slide it back across a tablecloth and call it nothing. That's my story, one folder I almost never opened, a pen I picked up and then set back down, a wrench that's been in my pocket through every single moment that ever mattered. If anyone has ever looked at everything you built and called it nothing, go count it, out loud, today. And if this story reached you, send it to the woman who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.